Zij van hier. have to show YouTube. And the first one?
Yeah. Don't do anything. No, because it's on YouTube.
Yes.
From?
From YouTube, I will show a video.
Oh, okay.
And the first one?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Then I will just change it.
Okay.
Escape.
So now minus.
Okay. It was open already, but I guess you closed it.
Can I take a pen?
Yes. Ik zal even. Ja. I hope it works.
I hope as well. It should work.
Yeah.
All right. It just stopped.
Very few people have. Back to the map. It's left for another. It's a deal now. You've been allowed to go.
Ja. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Willem van der Brugge. I'm the Secretary General of the Confederation of European Probation. And actually, I will not open this conference. I will leave that up to my Vice President of the Confederation of European Probation and Policy Officer of the Latvian Probation Service, Mr. Imants Jurevicius. And for your information, the whole conference is on live stream, so that you be aware of that. We use that. Imants, the floor is yours, yes? And you will use...
Yes, and short introduction maybe.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Imants Jurevicius. I'm not policy officer, I'm project manager, but it's like policy officer in Latvian Probation Service. And I was asked to say some welcome words to our guests who are attending this conference from many countries. And I believe this is the first time for many of you when you come to Latvia. Therefore, I prepared a short video for you just to get to know where you came what Latvians are, and I will continue after.
So it's Latvia's turn to take over the presidency of the Council of the European Union. What should you know about the country that's going to lead its 27 sisters for the next 6 months? Let's start with something a true leader needs: honesty. So here it is. Your next leader is flat in landscape, quiet in temper, cold in temperature, and small in size. Small is not a bad thing. It means that we are used to looking at things more closely. We polish, we angle, we untangle, and we fine-tune until everything is just right. We pay attention to detail. And as we all know, the devil is in the detail. Honestly, our winters are cold. For 6 months of the year, it is actually snowing here. However, winter has taught us to think ahead and to be prepared for both easy times and hard ones. It's called planning. To be honest, almost everything is flat in Latvia. We don't have the highest waterfall, but we do have a really, really wide one. So we look far, we look wide, and we don't like our vision to be hampered by anything closer than the horizon. Also, our landscape gives us plenty of room for imagination, which leads to creativity, which in turn leads to arts and innovation. It's true, we didn't invent the...
People can eat.
internet, but we do have one of the fastest internet speeds in the world.
Honesty.
Collections of art and architecture in Riga, to the largest choir festival in the world, to modern art, to world-famous opera singers and ballet dancers. Without making much noise, we've given the world some of its finest classical musicians. And we say almost nothing about our food, but it's just because we've learned that it's not polite to speak with a full mouth. Our food is to be enjoyed, not to be discussed. To be honest, about 50% of Latvia is not covered in forests, which means that the other 50% is. That's why Latvians are a bit closer to nature than the average European finds normal. We drill birch trees for sap, we pick all kinds of mushrooms and eat them. We shock our immune systems by jumping from hot saunas into ice-cold lakes and back again. The truth is, we don't always smile, but when we do, it comes from the heart. Latvians are kind of like coconuts. We may be kind of hard on the outside, but when you crack the shell, you'll find a truly friendly soul.
Pleased to meet you, honestly.
To be precise, we are not presiding in this Council of Europe at the moment. That was made some couple years ago, but I believe it's a pretty good portrait of Latvians, and the Latvians are like coconuts, and it's very popular in Latvia. Actually, that's true. When you meet Latvians, they are not very friendly. They are not like very extrovert and open, but no. If you will have some risk-taking behavior, you will take some chances. I think it will be very rewarding, at least if we speak about Latvians. And this is very important conference for Latvia. I hope it will be also a very important conference for Europe. In Latvia, for several years, we have already specialized system and work with sexual offenders in probation and prison system as well. And every year we organize separate conference for our sex offender specialists. We have at the moment 70 specialized probation officers, and we bringing them together every year so that they can speak some issues between themselves. And we also invite some experts from mental health and child protection agencies, and they do some presentations. And this is very nice that we have this opportunity to bring them here as well, together with even wider community of experts, and to stream online this conference, so that not only Latvian specialists that we have in probation and prison service can see this, but also from various ministries and municipalities. we had a lot of interest to be part of this conference, and I think we in total received around 200 applications only from Latvia to be here. And of course, we were not able to accommodate everybody, but we organized this live stream, and it will be available, I understand, on our YouTube channel. After conference, we will discuss also with Willem regarding possibility to transfer this material to CEP website as well. And I'm aware that in Europe there are many professional networks for specialists and academics who work with sexual offenders.
You don't know anything about politics? It basically goes like this. Estonia is depressed.
Oh, okay. I have no idea what's happening.
Willem, what you did there?
I have no idea.
Yeah, okay. YouTube just continued. And I know that there is not a conference we are attending for several years from Latvia in United Kingdom and Ireland. There's the ATSO conference, also a very important network for more scientifically oriented specialists who work with sexual offenders. And there's ATSA, North American organization. But all organizations at the moment are more, those organizations I mentioned, more representing this, I would say, Anglo-Saxon, this experience and knowledge on work with sex offenders. And we don't have so much anything, maybe something on a regional level, but not for Europe, where you can bring together from continental Europe people. And this was, I think, one of the reasons why we came up with this idea that we should organize this conference, that CEP should connect people from various its members from various European countries, because in most of the countries, I'm sure there is at least one expert in the probation or prison service who is leading the policy development in this field. And later it will be also, there will be a presentation about sex offender survey CEP performed. And during this survey, we also asked our members to identify this person, who is the most knowledgeable and most experienced on sex offending issues, so that we can somehow, be aware of this person and involve him in some networking activities, send to him emails directly, and get a response. And I hope this is the first conference and not the last one. And we will repeat those European conferences on work with sexual offenders, more practice-oriented, and in coming years as well. I don't know where it will be next year. Usually we do this like organizing this announcement that we would like to organize a conference, who would like to host the conference, and then it's evaluated and so on. But maybe after 2-3 years, there will be another one. And I really hope that our excellent scientific director, Kieran, will also remain with us and will assist in establishing this truly European network for those who work with this special category of offenders. And we also have high hopes for the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe also will pay attention towards this, and about that, I would like to give word to my colleague Willem to speak more about more wider European dimension as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe that. I will take this seat here because I'm sitting a bit low, so otherwise you can't see me. Thank you, Imans, for this nice introduction and all the technical issues to YouTube. We are delighted to have you here to participate and share in this special CEP conference on management of sexual offenders. As I said, my name is Willem van der Brugge. I'm the Secretary General of the Confederation of European Probation. And this event is kindly hosted by the Latvian Probation. And I'd like to thank the Director General from the Latvian Probation Service, Mr. Mihāls Papsujevits. Where is he? He's sitting there. And for his outstanding hospitality. And I also like to thank, well, you saw him, Mr. Imants Jurevicius, and all the colleagues from the Latvian Probation Service for organizing the conference here, actually in Riga. And prison service too. Thank you, Imants. And of course, I thank you all for coming. That many of you travel long distances serves us to remind us all how important our work is. But before I will speak about this particular event, let me introduce briefly CEP. The Confederation of European Probation is a non-political, non-governmental organization which brings together probation services from around Europe. And CEP is a member-based organization founded in 1981 by, at that time, Western European countries, 11 to be precise. But summer 2018, CEP counted 87 members from 44 countries, of which are 26 EU member states, large and small, young and matured. And when I mean young, well, Slovenia is here. That's the youngest probation organization, I think officially started this year. And I think many colleagues from the Netherlands are here. We're from 1823, so that's really old. From the north and south, from east and west, but always moving organizations working on the edge of care and control. Nowadays, CEP is the single largest European network organization for the sector of probation and community justice. It also includes academics, and some of them are here, and researchers from all over Europe in its network. The goals of CEP are to enhance the profile of probation and to improve professionalism in the field on a national and European level, sharing the same values and probation principles. It therefore promotes cross-border cooperation by organizing many events on actual topics in probation. And by events, I mean conferences, seminars, workshops, expert meetings, and even a summer course. Some examples: CEP organized the first World Conference on Probation, 2030 London. September 2018, we organized the third edition of Alternative to Detention in Central and Eastern Europe in Timișoara, in Romania. And next year, we will organize a special conference for the Eurasian region, that's on the roll. And 2020, we will organize the 12th edition of the Conference on the Use of Electronic Monitoring. CEP now runs 7 expert groups on various probation topics, and the management of sexual offenders is one of them. Next year, by the way, we hope to organize our first webinar. And by making reports of these events available, by publishing its digital newsletter and through its website, CEP stimulates the exchange of ideas on probation via its network. In this way, it makes an important contribution to the development of community sanctions and measures. And CEP is a recognized authority on probation practice and expertise in Europe. One could call also CEP a one-stop shop on probation matters. And as Iman says, to European bodies such as the European Union and the Council of Europe, CEP is the spokesman for the sector of probation, providing expertise and comparative data. CEP is therefore the voice of probation in Brussels and Strasbourg. And then regarding the management of sexual offenders, we managed to get that topic on the agenda of the Council of Europe. So I hope this will result in recommendations on the management of this specific group within the years to come. You will hear about that. Now I come back to this specific event. The initiative to organize this conference and putting the program together has been the work of the expert group on management of sex offenders, also known as the Sexual Offender Special Interest Group, SOSIG. It was set up in 2012 by my predecessor, Mr. Leo Tigges, and he's in the audience. Thank you. The expert group managed to put out, I think, an interesting program together, which I hope will inspire you for further development on the management of sex offenders in probation practice. Members of the expert group will all contribute to the conference in one way or another. CEP's most valuable part, by far, is the network itself. That's why we organize events like this. And in that sense, I like to encourage you to meet colleagues, share best practices, and exchange knowledge in the days to come. Before I hand over to the first speaker, there are always household announcements. You will see Miriam running. Sometimes she brings me notes like this. This is what you have to say. It's important. The coffee break is in the lobby bar, but you already noticed. Lunch is in the restaurant where the breakfast was. And please, when you leave this room, leave your headphones here if you use them. All conference presentations will be published on the CP website. And pictures will be taken and also published. There will be 2 colleagues from the Latvian probation service who have roving mics. So if you have questions after a presentation, please feel free to get a question, not a statement, a question. And we will see if we can manage that. So once more, I would like to say on behalf of CEP, welcome. Welcome in Riga. And I hope you will have inspiring days, learn a lot, and will meet lots of inspiring colleagues. There's one thing I have to say more. He's sitting here, Kieran McCartan. Tomorrow he will share the conference. We decided to split, which is nice. Perhaps you can stand up that people can see you, Kieran. Well, it'll take 1 hour and they know you all. So now I'd like to start. Yeah. Floor is yours. I give the floor to my colleague, Audrey Ellis. We send out a survey. Iman was already mentioning that. And Audrey will present the results of that survey. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. As said, my name is Audrey, and I work for the Dutch Probation Service. I'm specialized in working with sexual offenders and in the method of circles of support and accountability. Since last year, I started as the chair of the expert group Sex Offenders for the Confederation of European Probation. I also co-founded the Circles Europe Association with other experts from the former Circles for EU project. The first formal event of the Circles Europe Association will be launched tomorrow morning, as you can see on your program. As the chair of the Sex Offender Expert Group at the CEP, it's my honor to present you the outcome of our questionnaire. But before I will come to that, please let me first thank you, our colleagues of the Latvian Probation Service and the CEP, for hosting our first CEP conference on sex offender management in this comfortable venue. The questionnaire has inspired us as organization to set up the program as it's presented to you. So thank you for filling in the questionnaire and finding contact persons in your countries. So as the chair of the expert group, I will find to plan a follow-up meeting in 2019 with you. But I guess our next meeting is more a modest one than this one. But I can assure you that that meeting is also an addition to our work, an important work, with working with sexual offenders in probation. Do not underestimate the importance of sharing the latest development in knowledge and best practice. So having said that, let me show you some numbers.
It's on your desk.
We asked the main question, what's happening within your jurisdiction regarding various aspects of working with sexual offenders in community? And the first question was, are there specialized risk and need assessment tools for sexual offenders? And as we can see on the slide, most, so 65%, is already using risk assessment tools. Is there a multi-agency cooperation arrangement to ensure public safety protection from sexual offenders in your country? 47 has established multi-agency cooperation. That's 8 out of 17. In our workshop sessions, you can participate to hear more about those challenges. Is there a specific policy or arrangement to prepare sexual offenders to be released from prison into community? 6 out of 17 do not have anything like this. So I hope we can inspire those countries by sharing good practices, giving information and tools to start with specific policy. Then we asked if there are supervision arrangements in your country for working with specific groups of sex offenders. Established and in function, 41% of the countries. Working towards it, 12%. And not existing any kind of program, 14%. What about community management? 44, so most countries do not have community management like circles and support. So after this presentation, Dr. Mechtelt Heuwing is sharing us how this method of community engagement keeps everybody safer. And what about treatment programs? 47 has treatment programs established and in function, but 8 out of 17 do not have specific treatment programs yet. Hopefully, you get inspired during this 2-day lasting conference. And tomorrow morning, Mrs. Wieneke Smit will share information about the who, the what, and the how in sex offender treatment. Do you have good practices due to working with sex offenders? 5 countries do not have professional support system to work with sex offenders. There's a mix of good practices, and I hope this conference gives you the opportunity to share good or bad practices. Is there a national strategy for prevention or treatment? And do you have any legal basis? 8 out of 17 do not have a national strategy or legal basis for prevention or treatment. So hopefully this conference and our follow-up meeting next year is an inspiration for countries to develop policy or ask the CEP for some advice. So after this questionnaire, we sent some additional questions to our European CEP members. Questions like, does the probation service in your country work together with a university or other independent researchers? In case not, would they be able and willing to work together with a university? So working together or start in the near future, 8 out of 10 said yes. Which laws, if any, does your country have regarding to the punishment of sex offenders? 8 countries do have a criminal code and 2 countries do have a penal code. Which policy, if any, does the probation service in your country have regarding to work with sexual offenders? To offer treatment and set up a relapse prevention plan and special training, 5 of the 10 countries. What kind of specific sex offender risk assessment tools are used in your country? So 7 countries already use the static, stable, and acute, and we'll come to that tomorrow morning. What kind of operation does your country and justice system use when working on the prevention of new sex offenders? MAPA, multi-agency, and we'll come to that in the workshops, 6 out of 10. So as the chair of the expert group Sex Offenders at the CEP, I hope our conference program helps you to gain information and share knowledge with each other. I wish you an inspiring 2 days, and thank you for doing such great jobs in society with this special group of offenders. And now it's my privilege to announce Dr. Mechtelt Heuwing from Avans University. She did lots of research about circles in the Netherlands, and I don't know how she finds the time to be a project leader for circles with sex offenders, how to integrate into community. The floor is yours, Mechtelt. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Audrey, for this introduction. And she stresses the doctor. And as you can see, I'm not very young anymore, and I only got my doctorate like 3 years ago. So that's really an accomplishment. Thanks. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I feel personally very honored. And I'm also very grateful that this conference is offering a platform for circles of support and accountability. Well, that's a bit too... the work of a probation officer is historically about reintegration and rehabilitation of offenders in the community. And probation officers, in essence, are social workers. And in the rehabilitation framework, the ex-offender has to change in order to become a respectable member of the community again. And forensic social work and offender therapy are there to support this change. But in the past 2 decades, there has been an increased concern for victim needs, and especially in the area of sexually violence and victimization, which, and I really want to stress that, is very good and was long overdue. I started working in this field studying victims of sexual violence. So I really am convinced that it's really good that there is more attention for victims. Because the personal and societal consequences of sexual offending became more known and more evident. And almost all countries, and I expect Latvia as well, have had their own national sexual traumas. And as a consequence of all these developments, the legislation in many countries has become more punitive, sentences have become longer, and sex offenders have become the focus of interest of risk management, the risk management discourse, and risk management schemes. So, usually we seek to reduce sexual offending by putting long sentences, strict license conditions, and strict monitoring schemes in place. And sometimes those are not bridges, but barriers to sex offender rehabilitation. So the challenge for probation is to avoid the false division between risk management discourse and the rehabilitation discourse. Both are in the interest of victims and society, and both are effective ways of reducing reoffending, and especially when they are combined. But there's only one person that really can prevent sexual offending, and that is the offender himself or herself. He or she needs to gain control over his or her behavior and needs to build a non-offending life. However, for sex offenders, the opportunities are limited. First of all, sex offenders in the mind of the public are seen as the notorious child abuser and almost have become an archetype of evil. They are often seen as incurable monsters, endangering moral values and endangering the innocence of our society. The framing of sex offenders as a dangerous threat to society is a symptom of a more fundamental development in postmodern secular societies. And in late modern history, many Western societies have become fear-driven societies, and which have become preoccupied with risk and the prevention of risk. And therefore, sex offenders face social isolation, sometimes sought by themselves to avoid social control and punishment, sometimes inflicted by the erosion of their social network of friends and families due to their offense, sometimes resulting from the lack of social skills. But social isolation appears to be one of the key risk factors of sexual reoffending, not as a direct factor, but supporting other risk factors. While attachment to others and social interactions and exchange of social goods are basic human needs that are of direct impact on our mental health, they are also factors which are difficult to change for a probation worker or for a therapist. But social isolation is not the only risk factor. And as you will see in the risk assessment workshops, there is a plethora of risk factors. And while sex offenders are often put into categories, In reality, no one sex offender is like the other. All have their individual combination of risk factors. And this stresses the need for an individual and tailor-made approach, and which is, of course, challenging financial, organizational, and professional resources. Finally, the essence of probation work is that the probation officer is operating in different worlds, which was defined by Paul Sr. That's his model out there. The management of sex offenders is often placing the probation officer in the overlapping and sometimes conflicting areas where values, policies, and practices can clash, and where the probation officer, in his or her duty to support the offender, is seeking cooperation with the other worlds. Circles of support and accountability can offer support in sex offender management as an additional service in the field of probation. So, what is Circles and how does it work? The Circles model, in essence, comes down to a group of volunteers who support and monitor a sex offender who is re-entering the community. There are a number of figures on the left side. You will see there the yellow on below, which is core member. In Circles, we do not talk about sex offenders anymore because he wants to be an ex-sex offender. Therefore, they are called core members. They are the ones the whole Circle model is evolving around. We are working with medium to high-risk sex offenders who are high in need of social support. And very important, they are working together with the Circle on a voluntary basis because they need to be prepared to talk with our volunteers and to exchange information. Then we have the volunteers. Those are locals, local citizens. They are well-trained from diverse backgrounds and diverse ages. Practically everybody can become a volunteer, everybody who supports the Circle model and is willing to engage with sex offenders. The professionals are professionals who are involved in sex offender reentry or aftercare schemes like the probation officer, the therapist, the local police officer. And then there is the Circle coordinator. He is or she is a professional, well-trained in the COSA model and experienced in coaching and dealing with sex offenders. So how does this work? The volunteers and the core member together form the inner circle. Usually it's 3 to 5 volunteers, and they meet on a regular basis. Most often once a week. Later in the progress, they can meet less often and have individual meetings in between. The volunteers, they know about the offense because the core member is talking within the circle about their offense and about their risk factors. And they just discuss daily issues, but also situations that may be difficult. They talk about what the core member wants to learn, what he wants to achieve, and how they can support him with that. Basically, it comes down to advise, assist, and befriend, which sounds familiar to many probation officers as well. They work on agreed goals, and these goals are the goals of the core member, very important. They also engage in social activities like having coffee together, go out, going for a walk, going to a football match, whatever. The whole idea is to build strong social relationships and to help the core member to develop himself and to get confidence again. There are, of course, some safety rules, and all the information that is shared within the inner circle is also conveyed to the circle coordinator. The volunteers write little reports about every meeting they have with the core member, and they sign an agreement at the start of the circle that information is exchanged. Because the whole idea is that whenever there are any signals of risky situations, risky behavior, then this information is also shared with the circle coordinator, who then can decide, do I need to exchange this with the officials in the outer circle? Do we have to intervene, or can we deal with it within the circle? The outer circle, those are the professionals who are willing to support the inner circle. They give advice and they intervene if necessary. They meet every 3 to 6 months to exchange how's the circle going on, what's process going like. And sometimes they also meet the inner circle, meet the volunteers, and very often they are very, how do you say it, very surprised with the motivation of the volunteers. The circle coordinator, he selects the core, he or she, sorry, Audrey, she is our first senior circle coordinator. She is selecting the core members and the volunteers, training the volunteers, and is very close connected to the inner circle, supervising, monitoring, coaching the volunteers. There is a lot of contact going on between the inner circle and the circle coordinator. Very often after a circle meeting, there's telephone calls, memos written, exchanges. So that's really a very interesting and very intensive job. Is this an effective means? It seems that circles can achieve a lot in helping to reduce sexual reoffending. There's not a lot of research, but the research that has been done on circles always shows that circles are supporting the decrease of sexual reoffending. We have, which is really the gold standard of effect studies. There's one randomized controlled trial in the United States by Grant Ewell. He compared 50 core members with 50 sex offenders who were not in a circle, had a follow-up of 6 years, and in the COSA group, the risk of rearrest for sexual offending was like 88% lower than in the non-COSA group, which is really impressive. Of course, that's only one research, but we have other research by Robin Wilson, research done in the UK, and they always are showing very high numbers of reducing sexual offending. There are some concerns about this research of COSA, of course. It's limited, very often small groups, but all the research points into the same direction, and surely we need more research, but it's really very reassuring that we are doing the right thing. Well, the circles model is unique in the way in which both victim and society concerns and offender concerns are met. The motto is no more victims and no one is disposable. And in a number of qualitative studies, 4 key components of effective circles are always coming forward. And for circle providers, these are the things they are looking for. First of all, an effective circle addresses the social need by offering practical and emotional support and advice on all kinds of small or big issues, by building strong relationships within the inner circle. Good circles provide the core member with a sense of trust and belonging, a sort of adult attachment that many of them hadn't experienced before. A good circle supports the development of motivation and engagement in the transformative process of becoming a desister, and helps the sex offender to take responsibility for his own choices and behavior. A good circle complements sex offender therapy. An effective circle also is aware that risk and risk factors are very different for different sex offenders, and discusses the individual risk with the core member in a respectful but open way. And only if risk and risk factors are known to the volunteers, and only if there is an open and respectful relationship in which the core member feels that volunteers are there to support him in his struggle, then he will feel safe and free to be open and let volunteers question him about risky situations and behavior, knowing that the information will be shared with the circle coordinator and eventually with the outer circle. Finally, a good circle is reflective and adaptive. The circle is supervised and coached by the circle coordinator, who encourages the circle and the individual members to reflect on what is going on within the circle. Volunteers, as I said, they write memos about all contacts they have with the core member, and they have individual supervision and individual and group sessions together to evaluate, and every 3 months they evaluate the process of the core member using a structured format. The diversity of the circle volunteers is also a key strength. We have people from all walks of life, like young students, and retired persons. We have people from low education backgrounds, from university backgrounds, from being a director of a prison or former director of a prison to a young man who's working in the streets. So the diversity is very important and is a strength, because then the circle is able to find solutions from all kinds of perspectives and can share different opinions, and the core member can take whatever fits in his situation. While these are important characteristics of an effective circle, there is no guarantee that a circle will work well. It's all about the people in the inner circle. Sometimes it matches perfectly, sometimes it doesn't match, and then a circle doesn't really get going. Sometimes they do not succeed in building trust and openness, and sometimes a core member is too demanding. Sometimes volunteers need to solve their own issues outside the circle, and therefore a key ingredient for success is the circle coordinator, who is experienced and dedicated, who coaches but also intervenes if the circle is not going very well. Some circles are not successful and end prematurely before the circle goals are met. But usually, majority of circles are really working very well. Working with sex offenders is not a hobby. It's serious and meaningful business. The community is paying for COSA and counting on circles to work in their interest. So therefore, circles need to be accountable for their work and need to hold up high quality standards. Sex offender needs are the motor behind the motivation of the volunteers and the sex offender himself, but safety of volunteers, safety of the community comes first. So how do we achieve that, the high quality standards? Well, of course, the selection of the sex offender is based on a thorough evaluation of risk and needs. We stick to serving medium to high risk sex offenders because circles are not cheap. You don't want to spend all your money on people who wouldn't recidivate anyway, and also too intensive measures can be stigmatizing to sex offenders as well. So We stick to the medium and high risk group. Then the volunteer selection process. You want to have people who are really motivated, who are stable. They have to fill in an application form. There is an information interview. Then there is a 2-day training event for volunteers, and only then, after the training event, there is a selection discussion, because the training event is also, for the circle coordinator who does the training, a way to have a good look at volunteers. How are they cooperating? What's the motivation? Will it work? So there is a criminal records check, which doesn't mean that people who have been formally been convicted for an offense cannot be in a circle as a volunteer, but you want to know what kind of risk is there. Candidate volunteers are always asked about their own sexual trauma history, because it doesn't mean that they cannot become a volunteer, but you need to be aware of, are there any triggers for a volunteer that you have to be aware of? And there are many ex-victims in a circle, as there are a lot of victims in society anyway. So, and then there's discussed, are there any specific issues that you need to take into account? When the supervision is very intense, I told you about, through reports, memos, email, telephone, WhatsApp, that means that the circle coordinator needs to be available and responsive. It's not a 9-to-5 job, more or less 24/7. Don't want to put you off, but on the other hand, it's very inspiring, all the circle coordinators tell so. The circle coordinator needs to be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses in a circle, and therefore good training and good knowledge of circle dynamics, as well as knowledge of sex offenders, is essential. And therefore all circle coordinators need to pass an intensive training of 3 days at least. Also, high quality relationships with professional agencies are important, because of those are the people that are referring sex offenders to circles, but also those are the people who offer advice and expert knowledge and help to open opportunities for participation and to intervene in case of imminent risk. So, circles are not a short-term solution. Circles last as long as necessary. Sometimes that's a year, sometimes it's 1.5 years, but there are circles that are really running for years and years and years and are still necessary. So, and all the time, circles need high quality supervision. COSA are projects with high impact but low in volume, and therefore they are not cheap and need financing over a long period of time. COSA projects never operate in splendid isolation, but are really embedded in the national and local context. And these contexts are of influence on how you can run a circle project. Like on a national level, there is sex offender legislation, which is of influence on your work. The terms of supervision are different, terms of license conditions, how are sex offenders looked at the community? Is their treatment available? Is it the norm or is it rather an exception? What's the level of expertise on sex offender management? And also, how difficult will it be to find volunteers? Is there a volunteering culture in your country, or is that really an exception? And what are funding opportunities for circles? Is there a chance that the volunteers will get recognition for their work? Because if not, it may be more difficult to find volunteers. In the local context, the area that the COSA project is working, you will have to work together with other organizations which are active in this field. Like police, sex offender treatment or supervision, and you need to cooperate with them and you need to inform them. And there may be shared values and goals, but there may also be differences. In the Netherlands, sometimes the police has very different views on how to deal with sex offenders than the therapist. But both may sit in the outer circle and they have to talk to each other, which can deliver very interesting and fruitful discussions in the outer circle. Processes of referral and information exchange need to be developed and discussed. And local resources and needs may be very different. If you have a COSA project in an area where there is a prison facility, for instance, and many offenders are released in that area, then you have more referrals, more organizations working with you probably, than when you're in a very rural area where maybe only 3 or 4 sex offenders are living and you have a completely different situation. So you have to look into that. All COSA projects, most COSA projects are rather small and it's a very specific way of working. So working together with other projects is very helpful and supportive for COSA projects. So we also seek we seek to interact with other COSA projects and inform each other. Well, the big question always is, will we be able to find volunteers for our circles? In 2014, in an international Circles for EU project, which also Latvia was involved in, and Imans was working together with a lot of other people. We conducted an international web-based survey among population panels on their community views on sex offender rehabilitation. And we did that in 9 European countries. And not surprisingly, in general, the public opinion for sex offenders in the community was not very positive, not as negative as we always think, because the minority who has less negative, or the people who have less negative views usually are not heard of. But still, community, public views on sex offenders in the community tend to be more negative. But in this questionnaire, we also explained a little bit what COSA is, what it does, and we asked about if they would be supportive of such a project. And there is a substantial support for COSA in the communities. And we also asked, well, knowing how it works, would you yourself be willing to become a COSA volunteer? Which doesn't mean they really will, but you are looking for support. Well, and the percentages show that there is a certain amount of people in all these countries that would really be thinking of becoming a volunteer. If you translate this into real figures, there is a high potential of volunteers. You only have to find them and engage them, which is the trick. We have learned in the Netherlands that just going out in the open, putting advertisements in newspapers, usually generates a lot of applications of volunteers. Even negative publicity about sex offenders generates new applications of volunteers. Well, if you start a COSA project, there are variations. Some projects are developed top-down and are fully incorporated into and run by criminal justice agencies, and others are developed bottom-up by local initiatives and organizations, just like the Canadian projects, which were really the first COSA projects. And some sites have more hybrid characteristics. It has opportunities and difficulties, either form of project development. Usually funding is more a problem for bottom-up COSA sites, but on the other hand, they have more of a local span and are more flexible and innovative. And on the other hand, top-down projects often are hindered by bureaucracy and funding restrictions, but often have more structural funding. So COSA projects initiated and managed by government agencies are understandably more susceptible to legislative oversight and accountability, whereas ground-up, bottom-up, community-driven initiatives enjoy more freedom. But community projects sometimes find it difficult to find support from professional organizations, which means that referrals are less likely. And also sometimes quality standards and accountability in terms of research may be a problem because of lack of standardization and lack of funding. And this was also shown by a study in the US by Elliott and Zayek. Projects run by justice organizations often enjoy more structural funding, but are less free in their actions. For example, in the Netherlands, core members who are not under probation supervision cannot have a circle by the probation organization because then the Ministry of Justice is not paying for that service. Therefore, we now start a second COSA project which is run by a volunteer organization. And this project has now acquired funding for a pilot, and we hope to be able to find more structural funding in the future. So, as I said, circles have been described as high impact, low volume, and many circle projects are small-scale initiatives. And nevertheless, they need to maintain high level of quality, since they are working with a group of offenders that is in the center of public attention. COSA projects, which are not run well and have safety issues, can do damage to the whole circles model and to other projects as well. And in order to encourage the exchange of expertise and experience, and to support the development of healthy and strong COSA projects that meet these quality standards, we, and this is a group of COSA providers and supporters from different European countries, have in the past year worked at the formation of a Circles Europe Association. And we are really very thankful and proud that the official start of the association was granted to us at this conference. Thank you, Imans and Willem. And we very warmly would like to invite you to join us at our founding event tomorrow morning. It's early, 8:30, but you are very welcome. And of course, there will be time all during the conference and the conference dinner to talk to us. And may I ask the people who are here from the Circles Europe Association to stand up so that other people can see who you are? Those are Anne from Belgium, Viana, our chair from the UK, and of course Audrey, and myself, of course. You will learn more about the objectives of the association and membership, very low-cost membership at the moment because we're still starting. And we are very inclusive as an association as well, since the chair of the founding board is Rihanna Taylor from England, so there's no Brexit in our Circles Europe Association. Well, thank you very much, and maybe there are still questions. And
thank you. We take time for some questions first. Yes. Who can I give the floor? Well, I always have a question. I'm quite known for that. Mechtelt, of course, I was intrigued by the volunteers. Can you tell a bit more about the recruitment? You talked about the profile. I was thinking, are all male or female? You didn't mention that. and the specific training they get?
We are looking for a very mixed group of volunteers who is really representing the community. So young, old people, in between, males and females. We usually in the COSA projects, there are a bit more female volunteers than male, but more male volunteers than in other volunteer organizations, usually volunteering. I don't know how it is in Latvia, but in the Netherlands, there are more female volunteers than male volunteers, but the ratio is a bit more even in the COSA projects. There are people like students in the cities where there is a social work education or a university who is delivering criminology. There are usually a lot of students who want to become circle volunteers. They cannot become a volunteer in the course of their education to get credits for their education, because then their motivations would sort of be different. But usually they see it as a very helpful opportunity to get more experienced and to learn about sex offenders. But it is a very mixed population. The training event, well, Audrey is doing the training. She would be able to tell you a lot more about that. But it is really about getting the, it lasts for 2 days. And it is about getting an idea about what sexual offending is, what a sex offender is, what's happening to sex offenders in detention. There's something like detention damage. They have to overcome that and get some hope and self-respect again. And also what are risk factors and how to deal with the many cognitive distortions that sex offenders ventilate. They always have these little stories to tell themselves and others why they are not responsible for what they did. Volunteers have to get insight into those dynamics to be able to go through that and pose the right questions, because they are really also sort of the representatives of the victims and sometimes have to take the perspective of the victim to confront a sex offender with the essence of his thoughts. So those are important parts, but also how to work together as a group. You have to, and how to encourage someone who is not willing to talk about what he did because there's a lot of shame. How do you do that together while not forming a sort of a front against the sex offender? So is there, what else? Those are the most important ingredients of the training. And also, of course, things like how to write reports and all the equality rules and safety rules and all that.
And is there a kind of, let's say, a golden rule to compose a group? Because if you have all social workers, well, they're more on care than on control, for instance.
Diversity is really the golden rule. So, and you can achieve diversity by mixing ages, by mixing backgrounds. Ideally, you mix everything. Really, diversity is the key, because then there is a really rich learning environment for a core member in a circle.
Kira? Yeah.
Thank you. Just feeding on from that, what's your perspective about victims of sexual abuse being volunteers in circles? Because we often hear that restorative justice doesn't work, that you're re-traumatizing the victim, that's feeding into issues around the core member. So just to follow on from that, what are your views about this and what safeguards do you put in place?
As I said, that's a topic that is discussed during the selection process. Candidate volunteers are invited to discuss their own sexual trauma history, if there's any, and if there are any issues they need to be aware of. But there are there are victims in circles as working as volunteers, and a couple of years we've done a research on what does a circle do to the volunteers, and we also assessed whether they had a victim history or not, and there was really no sign of that they were affected more than any other volunteer. Of course, it was a small research group, and we should look into that, again and more often. But there are no really signs that that is a problem. On the other hand, victims sometimes can give a very a different perspective in a circle, and sometimes it can be confronting for a sex offender if he hears. It's not always in the open in a circle, but sometimes it can be very confronting for a sex offender if there is someone with a own trauma history or someone in the family or friends. So it's, well, that's an issue. But volunteers should always discuss with the circle coordinator if there is a special type of sex offender that he or she would not want to work with. For instance, if you cannot work with a sex offender who has abused very young children, who has done this or that, or has been someone who made child porn videos or so, that should be discussed, because then you can see if there are any problems arising. Well, and I mean, 40% of all women have been victim of sexual violence in some form or the other. You cannot exclude 40% of the population from becoming a volunteer. So,
Marianne, can you introduce yourself?
Yes.
Please, yeah.
My name is Marianne Fuglistvedt. I'm a psychologist working in the Directorate of Prison and Probation in Copenhagen. And I have a question regarding the core member. You were telling us about their cognitive difficulties.
mm-hmm.
And are there any prerequisites for the core member to join the circle? Do they have to admit their offense, for example?
There are selection criteria. As I said, the level of risk is a selection criterion, and they have to at least admit to some extent that they did the sexual offense, because if they are really denying anything, there's nothing to talk about in a circle. But there are grades of admitting and denying. So, of course, at the beginning of a process, there's very often a sort of denial. Well, it wasn't that bad. She started it, whatever. All these types of, cognitive distortions. But we usually see, once a circle is getting along after a year, then that he starts to become more open and more openly can discuss what really happened and what his feelings were with that. So denying an offense, total denial is not working, but denial to some extent is not a problem, is accepted. Another selection criteria is if we have sex offenders with a certain amount of intellectual disabilities, that can be a problem as well, because it's a very reflective, a circle is rather reflective, talking. If very sex offenders with a low level of intelligence, they more often just need more monitoring than learning how to control themselves. That may be a difficulty. And people, of course, with psychiatric problems and addiction problems that need to be attended to first, sometimes that can interfere with the circle as well. So it's not a deselection criterion, but it needs to be taken care of, sometimes needs to be taken care of first.
More questions?
Thank you.
Could you make yourself known? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm David Briggs, a psychologist from the UK. When people talk about COSA, they often emphasize the support elements of it. Can you say a little bit more about the processes that the volunteers are expected to pursue to hold the core members accountable?
Very often support comes before monitoring and holding accountable, because there has to be a certain level of trust and openness in a circle. But from the very start, volunteers know about the offense, and the sex offender is expected to discuss his risk factors in the circle somewhere, usually in the first 8 weeks. So then he has to present, at least in the Netherlands, his relapse prevention plan, so the volunteers know what they have to be alert of and where they can help. What does that look like? Well, for instance, almost every week they're discussing what the sex offender or what the core member has done the last week. And sometimes there are details in that that need to be addressed. Have you been looking at your computer a lot? And what have you been looking at? Have you looking at any porn? Was it adult porn? And are you still feeling attracted to child porn? Things like that. Those are the kind of questions that volunteers ask. And sometimes they even come to an agreement when the core member asks one of the volunteers to have a look on his telephone or his computer every once in a while, just to make sure, to build in an extra measure for himself. And of course, the volunteers report to the circle coordinator. Yeah.
More questions? Then I have one, of course. Following the circle, of the probation circle of Peter Rayner, I immediately was thinking of a famous case in the Netherlands, Benno L., where it all came together.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more about that? What happened?
What happened? Well,
And also my Dutch colleagues will know. Because
yeah,
it was,
they know about that. We
big
have
case in the Netherlands. By the way, it was a cross-border issue too, because he was originally from Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, but he offended in the Netherlands. He was a swimming trainer who trained children with mild development disabilities, and he took the opportunity in the swimming pool to sexually abuse those children. And when it came out, it was a huge situation in the Netherlands. He had abused many children, and there was this effect that you all know of when the community is really becoming vigilant and very aggressive. Of course, he was sentenced, he was in prison, and when he came out, everybody knew him. His face had been, and his name had been all over the press. And when he was released from prison, the mayor of the city where he wanted to live didn't want to have him. So he was sort of forwarded from one city to another to avoid a lot of conflict in the city. And finally, at the end, there was one mayor, one brave mayor in the Netherlands, in the city of Leiden, who took him on. And of course, this was also in the press. The press announced where he was living, in an apartment where a lot of elderly people lived. And of course, what you get then is there are protests, demonstrations, people going onto the streets. They were protesting on the wrong apartment because they got it wrong. They were protesting on the wrong side of the street, and the older people who lived there became more anxious of the protesters than of Benno L.
And also people from outside the city, who didn't live in Leiden at all.
It was like a sort, you know of that, a sort of a media event where all people who really want to express all their anger and so find an opportunity to protest. So, and the city, the mayor was under big pressure to expel him, but he said, no, a sex offender must live somewhere, and he will live here, and I will do the utmost to make sure that there are secure measures. So he invited COSA to form a circle of support around the sex offender, and lots of additional measures and extra volunteers. He wasn't going to set one step out of his apartment alone. So in fact, he was a sex offender with a low risk of reoffending, so which was kind of counterproductive, but well, the media attention did its work. And in the end, when people learned that there was a circle, when all these measures were taken into account, things calmed down and he could go on with his circle, and yeah, he really, things became more silent, and finally, after a couple, I think 2 years or so, his circle was coming to an end because it was no longer necessary, and he had reintegrated, and now he's living somewhere else in peace and quiet. And so there, the circle had a big function in calming down the community, which is also an important function of a circle, to help the community to see, well, we can take care of things ourselves.
Yeah, I remember one of the regional directors from the probation. She had to explain what COSA was at the local council, and the director general of the Dutch probation, which is an NGO, which is different as a state organization. He was in every talk show. He was on the radio. He was, well, Dutch colleagues will remember. And actually, that was very good promotion for probation, because he explained what probation was and that everybody should have a second chance, even sexual offenders. So in the end, it worked out well, as you said, and he moved to Germany.
Yeah.
But it made clear what, let's say, a commotion, as you should say, a sexual offense could give. So in that sense, circles coordinators should be prepared for that too. That they're working with a very controversial group of people.
When you're setting up a COSA project, one of the first things you have to have in place is a media and communication strategy, because the press will question you about it, and you will get reactions on Twitter, on blogs, on Facebook, whatever, and you have to be prepared for that. But that all settles down. That's only in the beginning.
Leo. I already introduced him, Leo Tigges.
Thank you so much. I have a question. What is, in your view, the ideal relationship between, on the one hand, the probation service, the supervisor, and on the other hand, the circles group? What is the role of the supervisor?
Usually it is a complementary role. The circles are not replacing probation, not replacing therapy or anything. They are additional. But of course, since when you look at the first this model, it's not a coincidence that I put circles in the same spot as probation. They really operate in the same sort of connection with these different worlds. And sometimes probation officers can feel a bit uneasy about what is the circle doing and how should I cooperate with the circle. They are doing sort of the same things. So it's important that a probation officer who is sitting in the outer circle is very aware of what the circle does and connects to the circle, but that they have different roles. The circle is very much operating from the community perspective, while the probation officer, of course, is a representative of the justice system, of the system, and has to make sure that all the rules are followed. But in the social work area, there can be overlapping tasks, and that needs to be discussed, because sometimes, or very often, the probation officer is the one who is doing the referral of the sex offender, and if he or she feels threatened by circles, then there's something going wrong in the referral process. So yeah, that needs to be discussed when a circle project is entering an area. They also need to discuss with all the professional organizations in the area to explain what COSA is, what does it do, how can we work together. You need to clear that before you start a project.
Iemans?
Hi. I wanted to ask about preconditions for introducing circles. Do you need any preconditions at all to start circles project in your country?
Preconditions is that at least there, well, you have to have that the government is supporting you, because if sex offending is not an illegal act in a country, well, what are you working with? But most countries have sex offender legislation. When the most important is, can you set up the circles model? Can you find the volunteers? Can you find the professionals who want to support in the outer circle? That is the basic. Can you work in cooperation with professional organizations, and can you find your volunteers and set up everything? And all this is very dependable on, can you find more or less structural financing, because projects are not cheap, even if there are volunteers working for nothing. But because of this professional support, they are not cheap and they last a long time. So funding is a key issue, and finding the cooperation with professionals who support and advise is also a key issue before you can start.
Matilda,
Brian, can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, yeah, Brian Dack from the Probation Service in Ireland. We have Circles, which is run by an NGO in cooperation with ourselves. And I was wondering, have you seen a trend in terms of difficulties being experienced where the coordinator is not coming from a criminal justice background? You mentioned earlier on the cultural differences between some of the professional organizations in particular in the outer circle. And has that posed a challenge where the coordinator comes from a criminal justice background and has therefore the trust of the different partners, whereas somebody coming from a non-criminal justice background, there's more difficulties?
That's usually the case where these bottom-up projects are starting. There's this example in Belgium where the circle coordinator is not from the justice service, but from a social service, and that works. It's gradually expanding, but is working. We are starting such a project in the Netherlands. Have there been any issues? Not that I am aware of. You think of things like, have there less expertise, less signaling risk or anything? This is also a bit of lack of research. We do not know. I'm not aware of any issues at all with circle coordinators who have not been in the criminal justice in the justice services, but we haven't studied that yet. Maybe we should look into that internationally. So.
Last question is for the lady.
Sorry, maybe I could just comment on that. In the UK, we have quite a few coordinators who don't have a criminal justice background. And actually we find that there's pluses and there's minuses, like most things. The key minus is that they don't always have the relationships into the professional organizations, particularly the police and probation. And sometimes that takes a bit of time to develop. On a plus side, though, they often bring a range of other skills that people in criminal justice don't have either, kind of more other links into the community, very often understanding about how voluntary sector organizations work, how to find funding, all of those kind of other skills. So it's not either or in our experience. It depends on the person, and it depends on the training that you give for those absolute essential aspects. So we welcome coordinators from non-criminal justice backgrounds, very much the same as we do from within criminal justice.
Thank you. The lady over there.
Morning. My name is Wendy Martin. I'm an inspector with the Probation Inspectorate in the UK, and we've recently completed a piece of work, although it's not published until January, about sexual offenders and probation's work with them. What I was really interested, obviously the funding from the UK has recently been withdrawn by the MOJ since, I think, September. I know some areas like London and Wales are still keeping it. I'm just wondering, I mean, you touched on it, the challenges going forward and how it will now operate in the UK, and I'll be interested to catch up with you later and talk about how you think that might work, because obviously that's a big challenge with that funding being withdrawn.
I didn't quite get a question, or was it a comment? Was
in terms of where is it going in the UK, where circle you see the direction of circles going, given the withdrawal of that.
Well, I think Rihanna can comment on that much more than I can do from the Dutch perspective, but there's a lot of difficulties for the circles in the UK, and we are very worried about that because it's such an effective measure, and it's threatening to be closed down, and that's, yeah, really would be a shame. Among all the other problems in the British transforming rehabilitation process, this is one of the downsides. Yes.
Okay. The last question for the
Sorry,
gentleman.
I'll just say a quick word on that, Willem, if that's okay. I don't want to say too much. I'm very happy to talk to people outside the room because this is really a meteor slot. But just to say, we're not about to close down, thank goodness, but we have trouble. We've had the last 6 months the most extraordinary challenges facing with the Ministry of Justice. What is positive, we have a lot of voluntary funders coming forward saying, Circles is so well known, it's such an amazing intervention, we don't want it to disappear, so they are supplementing funding. But we don't want to let Ministry of Justice off the hook, so we are still continuing the fight.
Okay. The gentleman behind you, you'd like to have the mic. And that's the final question.
Stef Veyen from the Dutch probation. Why is it also for the core member, the sexual offender, volunteering participation on this COSA? It is so effective, you said, and the method is very good. So why always volunteering being part of this COSA?
Can it be part of the license conditions? Well, a circle thrives on openness. And if a sex offender core member is obliged, is mandated to enter a circle, then there is this pressure of justice on him, and he will be less willing to open up in a circle. We have had that experience in the Netherlands as well, where a core member was sort of, sometimes they enter a circle voluntarily, but because they think, well, it is good on my record if I enter a circle. It's sort of the same, not real motivation. But when a core member in a circle is not willing to talk about his offense, then the circle has nothing to really work on and talk about. Then it's only about social support and social activities, and that's not what a circle is for. It's for talking about risk, and the core member really has to have some sort of motivation of developing himself into a member of society who is not offending anymore. There needs to be the motivation to get out of the criminal cycles to become a desister, because then there is the basis on what you can work with in a circle. If there is pressure, well, then there's all these other influences coming into a circle, putting the volunteers in a very difficult position, because the volunteers are there to represent the community, not necessarily the justice system.
Okay, thank you very much. The last question, of course, is for me. The last question is always, when will the coffee break take place? Soon. Before that will take place, I have very few household announcements to make. After the coffee break, we will start with the workshops, and those will take place. Perhaps you have seen that already in the corridor. There are 3 rooms, this main room, of course, and the breakout rooms are called Air, Aqua, and Terra. Nice names. And there is a list hanging in the corridor with your names on it for the specific workshops. The workshops will be repeated after lunch, and so we'll see each other back after afternoon coffee break. Coffee is in the corridor, and we continue at 11 o'clock. Before I forget, I have to show it anyway. There is, where is it? It's here. There is a Twitter account, #SexOffenders2018. I've seen already some people who use it. I invite you to tweet. It's good that your colleagues will know that we're here and that we're actually working. Enjoy your coffee break. Okay. Applause for the speaker. I hope not too. And maybe I will be in contact with someone I will contact you later.
Yes, I am. Yes. I think so. And so, was there much interest in European circles? Yeah.
Vice President and you deal with
Yes.
well, you are in your own, we will export you or push you to the prison, that's
Change their mind.
It's not professional management, it's like this, all the years now, doing that I don't believe
And some of them have their own
variety of future of this project, whether it is NGO or hybrid, and prison service at the moment is coordinated information service. On the other hand, I find it prison service do not like changes at all. Good reputation, processes and reputation for themselves and in England and also in the Netherlands, there's some struggle with it. So you have national police.
My presentation is
in next door. Right, so yeah, I want to say that it's very bad for the start circle if you don't have infrastructure. And you don't have because you have experts who are willing to work with entrepreneurs and put silver bullets in their heads. If you don't have experts who actually understand. That's a big issue for you understand the life still is we are still working one way and other reason is what we are without infrastructure and better cost of projects, we will start
which is interesting. And there's a lot of growth and jurisdictions. There is a problem. I'm have a coffee.
Who is the expert formally? You must listen, or is formal expert? What's the real expert, you know?
Lots of challenges still.
Yeah.
Ja, maar dan moet eigenlijk wel in andere talen willen. Oh. Ja, maar heb je nog meer flessen waar ik dat vanuit kan? Ja, ik heb dit ook zelf receptie gevraagd. Dus, ja, zou je willen? Voor de, dit is dan Terra 1, dus dan voor Aqua en Air. Aqua en Air? Ja.
I changed my presentation, but I ended up saving you all back.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. You might want to have people in front, of course. So yeah. Did you have some coffee also?
I'm going to get something to minute. It's a huge part of.
Oh yeah.
Have you processed these days? Can you talk about the breaking new code sweats? Yeah.
Usually I give lectures because I have a year in our university. It has been like 2 years now.
Latvian conference.
What we'll just do is we'll just wait a couple of minutes because there's still people mulling around outside, so there is. So hello, I'm Kieran, and this workshop is going to be around understanding how we reframe sexual abuse. I'm very happy to answer questions as we go through it. I would rather people say, I don't get that, or I don't understand this, rather than wait till the end. If you do want to wait till the end, that's fine. If you want to come up and ask questions by yourself at the end, that's fine as well. Okay, so one of the things that it's important to do is to set some context to this. When we talk about sexual abuse, we talk about how many people have been affected by it. However, okay, sorry. How many people are affected by it? And we don't really know the base rates, so we don't. Mainly because it's not always in people's self-interest or motivation to report sexual abuse. There's not a compelling argument always for victims to come forward. They may feel that they're at fault. They may feel that no one will take them seriously. It's not like other crimes. So, for instance, if you look at car crime or acquisition crime or burglary, you report that because you need to get your insurance money back. And we have a pretty good idea of how much burglary and car crime there is. But with sexual abuse, we don't really know. We have seen an increase in reporting over the past 20 to 30 years, especially since the women's movement and feminism in the 1970s and 1980s. And actually, feminism has done more for child protection than anything else, and that really needs to be acknowledged. So when we talk about base rates, we're talking about known base rates, reported base rates. And what we end up seeing is that depending upon where you look or what you categorize sexual abuse as, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 people report being impacted by sexual abuse at some point in their lives, which is a massive number. And when we then think about what Americans talk about as collateral consequences, when we think about all those people affected by it, it's even broader. Most people in this room probably know someone in their personal life, whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend, whether it's a colleague, that's been affected by sexual abuse. I think it's pretty safe to say that the vast majority of us know someone that's been impacted by it. So to start this reframing conversation, I think it's important to think about the impact of sexual abuse, not only on victims, but also on individuals who commit sexual abuse. We know it impacts people's psychological well-being. We know it affects their health, their socialization, many factors. I'm going to argue today that sexual abuse is a health issue and not purely a criminal justice issue. And we've got to spend a bit of time thinking about this. And one of the stats that I really want to kick this off with is if 1 in 4 people to 1 in 8 people are impacted by sexual abuse, and it impacts their lives and their health and their mental health and their socialization, what other thing that affects 1 in 3 people does the same thing? Cancer. We don't talk about sexual abuse the way we talk about cancer. We don't fund sexual abuse in the way that we fund cancer, either for victims or in terms of treatment, management, reintegration. And that's important to think about because actually, the way we talk about prevention of cancer, we can prevent sexual abuse. I firmly believe, and I'm going to spend the next hour and a half trying to convince you that we can prevent sexual abuse. As my old boss used to say, it's within our gift to do something about it. So just to sort of build on this, and this is a really good thing that was done in the UK by the Office of National Statistics, the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office. This is, I want to say, 2004, 2005. All we hear quite often is that, well, we know the rates and we know people who commit sexual abuse. And there's this argument for things like the registry, that the registry keeps us safe because we know who all the sex offenders are and we know where they are. Well, actually, that's not the case. If you look at this, if you just look at sexual offences, which includes rape and child sexual abuse, so this is based in England and Wales, and there's this idea that is between 430 and 517,000 per annum. That's the volume, that's the perceived prevalence. But when you get to this point and you look at convictions, you look how big the drop is from there to there. So while we have an idea of who some of our offenders are, the reality of the situation is we don't know who they all are. Not all of them get convicted. And so when we talk about registries and people coming out the back end and MAPA and community control and all of this stuff, we're talking about this population, not this population. And that's quite important, so it is. The other thing that I would say about this is that when you look at the estimated number of victims, we are talking about multicultural, multidimensional perpetrators and victims. And a lot of our convictions and a lot of our research doesn't reflect that. Most research on sexual abuse is based on white, Western, working class and middle class men. You look at the Canadian literature, you look at the American, the Australian, the UK literature. We haven't done as much work with Aboriginal communities. We haven't done as much work with people of ethnic and Black minorities. And we just assume that everyone's the same. And Imans was talking about this earlier. Our role is to share good practice. It's not to bring in cultural appropriation and say, this is what works in the UK, so this will work in Latvia, or this will work in Germany. It's about us saying, actually, how do we take this good practice and frame it in a way that is useful to different countries? I thought this was a very powerful slide. So this was something that was done by the NSPCC in the UK. And this is the cost of sexual abuse. Now, in this, they're talking about the cost of child sexual abuse. So they looked at things like health, so child mental health, suicide and self-harm, adult mental health problems. So when the child eventually becomes an adult, we know that victimization doesn't go away. We know it's something that victims and survivors live with on a daily basis. When we look at adult physical health, so drug, alcohol misuse, when we look at the cost of arresting someone, sending them to prison, putting them on community supervision, services for children, and the labor market. And I think this is an interesting one because we don't think about sexual abuse in these terms. That actually, if you've been a victim of sexual abuse, that will affect you. So you might have extended periods of sick leave, but you mightn't want to tell your employer why you're doing this. It may lead to these mental health problems and physical health problems, especially things like alcohol and drug misuse. We know that there's a high correlation between victimhood and drug use and self-harm and related issues, but also, with the perpetrators, that we know that depression, anxiety exists within these individuals. We know that there's drug and alcohol use. And actually, just even from the conversations we've been having today, we know how difficult it is to find them employment, meaningful employment. And so the NSPCC study estimated that the cost of child sexual abuse in the UK was between 1.6 and 3.2 billion pounds per year. So to me, this reinforces something. If it affects 1 in 4 to 1 in 8 people, if it affects their lifespan and everything around it, if it has collateral consequences for families and communities, and it costs this amount of money, we're not talking about a criminal justice issue. We're talking about an epidemic. In health terms, sexual abuse is an epidemic. And we've got to start thinking about wholesale societal change in the way that we talk about it. It doesn't do anyone any favors to have predefined victims and perpetrators and just to look at sexual abuse in them contexts. You look at the work of people like Stephen Smallbone and Richard Wortley, they talk about situational child protection. A lot of these things happen in context. So as a society, we've got to start thinking about this differently. So how do we do this? While the reality of sexual abuse is not constructed, while the physical abuse, whether that's rape, whether that's inappropriate sexual touching, whether that's the creation of child sexual abuse material, I, for one, don't believe in the word child pornography because it's not pornography, and pornography legitimizes it. And if you want to hear more, hopefully some of you will be going to Maggie Brennan's talk in the next session. But it is the way we talk about it and the way we frame it is constructed. We can do something about that. We can change that. And my argument always is, as professionals, that is part of our job. Now, I know the UK is sometimes unique, that they don't like to talk about what probation and the police do, and they don't want to go on TV, and, you know, we don't comment. But actually, you know, I think we need to comment, because actually a lot of good work is being done and a lot of things are changing, but we don't talk about the positive stuff. You only hear when there's a serious case review or when something goes catastrophically wrong, and then it's probation's not doing its job properly, ignoring the fact that it is doing its job very well with thousands and thousands of other people. So we have to keep in mind how these things change. So the societal factors like social networks, cultural and social attitudes, political systems, the media, education, social welfare, and concepts around social justice. And they interact with systematic factors like policing, courts, prison, and probation, ideas around rehabilitation, reform, reintegration, and integration. The evidence base, which is always very tricky when it comes to this area of work, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Funding, resources, and state support, community, media, and professional engagement, and reporting, as well as personal factors, experiences, your experiences, the experiences of others, of friends and family that you know, and peers, but also how you negotiate the evidence base. And all of these three, personal, systematic, and societal factors, interact to create conversations around the politics and social construction. And we can change some of these things. What are public views? Well, to be frank, public views are a mess. Very conflicted. On one level, everyone who commits sexual abuse is a monster, feeding on what Audrey said earlier and what Methil said. They believe that they should go to prison for long periods of time. They don't want them coming back into their communities. They want them to be managed in a very different way. However, research demonstrates public support for treatment, which is quite paradoxical, isn't it? Because you would think that if they don't want them in their communities and they don't want them coming back and they want them locked away for long periods of time, they wouldn't want treatment. And one of the things that we see a lot on a ground level is when you talk to people about sexual abuse, their attitudes change when it becomes about someone they know. When the perpetrator is maybe an uncle or a brother, when the offense is about downloading images as opposed to a contact offense, the narrative changes a bit. But that's because a lot of the time they haven't thought about it in personal terms. They have thought about it in the abstract as being about someone else who is radically different from them. But this gives me hope in the sense that if people believe in treatment and want people to get treatment, then we can start to do good informed work around this. But the problem is, it doesn't always get to that point. So when you think about politics, and we're going to talk a little bit about policy making later on, you have ministers, and ministers propose ideas and concepts, but ministers aren't at the coalface. They have researchers who maybe look at what the press is saying, who maybe talk to communities, who maybe read some research. So actually, what we need to do is make sure people are getting the right information so they can make informed decisions. Because what we end up seeing is when these personal factors and systematic factors and societal factors are driven by misconception, fear, poor engagement, and a lack of understanding, you get knee-jerk policy reactions. And you see this with big cases, don't you? If any of you are from countries where policy has been defined by big cases, suddenly there's a case and an MP comes out and says, we're going to have new policies around this and we'll introduce something. And they rush it through and they don't look at the evidence base, and it's very ideologically driven. And like one of the things that I do want to say as to a good counteraction to this is from the UK, when they looked at community notification and the role of community notification. So in the States, States is one of the only countries in the world that has complete community notification to information on registered sex offenders and where they live. In the UK, it took them 10 years to come up with a decision that actually they will have limited access to this, because they said, we do not want to be the same as the States. We do not want to do this. And taking that time and not having that knee-jerk reaction is really, really important. But what you find is this results in a fear-based criminal justice response. So it's about punishment. It's about more punishment. It's about incarceration. And it was funny, I was saying to someone yesterday, actually, that the problem with punitiveness is it's expensive. You have to build more prisons. You have to have a bigger probation service. You have to do X, Y, and Z, where actually, if you start thinking about alternatives, they can be more economically beneficial and it can do more societal work in the long run. So what is the current narrative? It's a high-profile issue. The number of perpetrators entering the system is continually increasing. If you look at the MAPA figures in the UK, they're going up, but they're going up across the board. And we have to be really, really careful about this, because people will say, but that means there's more sexual abuse. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't have good prevalence data. We don't have good base rates. But what we do know is more people are reporting sexual abuse. People are coming forward. So the number of institutional inquiries that are happening internationally and historical inquiries, victims feel like they can come forward. And actually, disclosure is a later life thing. If we think about people who are affected by sexual abuse in childhood, children mightn't have the language or the skills to talk about this in a real way. But adults, 20 years, 25 years after the occurrence, may have those knowledge and skills and may be more willing to come forward. Also, the criminal justice system is taking this more seriously. Now, there's two things I'll say about this. One, I thought we were at a stage where we had progressed, and this isn't about Ireland, and this isn't about the recent case in Ireland about rape myths and rape myths acceptance. You see this internationally. You see this across the board. I thought we had gotten to a point where we had a broader understanding that the way that you dress and the places that you go and whether you drink alcohol or not doesn't mean that you want to be victimized. But obviously we need further steps to go. But what we end up seeing is that the CPS takes this more seriously. The amount of time, the amount of cases being referred by the police has gone up. The amount of punishment by the criminal justice system has gone up. Sentencing has gone up. And there has been this, we will listen to you and we will support you. So that's one factor. Increased visibility of the offences. You just have to look at any national newspaper on a daily basis and you will find at least one story about child sexual abuse or adult sexual abuse somewhere within it. And high profile cases. So we talked about some high profile cases in the Netherlands in the last session, but also things like Marc Dutroux in Belgium, Jimmy Savile in the UK, the Catholic Church in Australia and in Ireland and in other parts of the world, again, highlighting the reality of this and making victims realize that actually maybe I can come forward. So we're seeing a surge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's more. And I wouldn't want people to go away and think that suddenly something's happened within the last 10 years where there's an explosion of sexual abuse. It's always been there, but we just haven't talked about it and we haven't framed it in a way that people feel comfortable with. But in an era of cuts, we often hear austerity's over. We often hear that there's more funding for services. I genuinely don't think that is translated to the ground, but more pressure is being put on people with limited resources being expected to do more. You see probation officers and police officers with bigger caseloads, having to do the same job in the same way. And that poses a real challenge. So a couple of, God, it must have been about a year ago, a guy called Simon Bailey, who was the police lead, I think he still is the police lead for sexual abuse in the UK, was talking about child sexual exploitation material. And he basically said, we can't police our way out of this. We don't have the resources or the manpower to arrest every single person that's looked at indecent images of children and sent them to prison. We just can't do it. So we need to look at alternatives. We need to think about other ways of doing this. And he was crucified in the press. But you look at things like the Lucy Faithfull Foundation and Engage and some of the work that they're doing, and there are alternative ways. And one of the most important things that he was getting at but didn't really say is, we don't know that people who look at images are going to go on and commit a contact offence. Some will, some won't. So we've got to really be able to prioritize who we're working with and understand the resources that we've got and use them effectively. But it does pose real challenges. So one of the things that we're going to argue is that actually if we drive things by knowledge, understanding, and engagement, we get realistic policy, which results in proactive, multifaceted approaches, and it's positive, informed, and achievable. Okay, so generally at the minute, we think of sexual abuse as this. It's a criminal justice issue. And that means it needs certain criteria. You need to have a victim, you need to have a perpetrator. The victim or a third party needs to go to the state, whether it's the police, and say a crime has occurred. That means it's after the fact. That means the abuse has already happened, and you're mainly dealing with the fallout of the abuse. It also means that it's focused on individuals. So you're talking about the vulnerable or the misguided or whatever rape myths you necessarily want to throw at it, victim. And then you're talking about the perpetrator who might be evil or sick or demented or whatever, but you're dealing with victims and perpetrators, and that's what you've got. You've got two classes of people. The main response is punitiveness. The victim will get help and support, and the perpetrator will more than likely go to prison or be on some sort of community sentence. But that doesn't sit well because the abuse has already happened. and you're just picking up the pieces from the abuse. So there's an argument that actually sexual harm is a public health issue, and sexual harm is a health issue because it happens across the lifespan, and it affects people across the lifespan, not only in terms of victims, but in terms of perpetrators as well. And the benefit about framing it in this way is it's proactive. It means you can do something about it. It's focused on communities, not on individuals. So how do you upskill communities about understanding sexual abuse, about being active bystanders, about being able to know when abuse is happening and how you respond to it? It's educational, and it brings in health agencies. So it becomes about schools, and it becomes about GPs, and it becomes about doctors, and not just about police officers and probation. It's focused on potential victims and perpetrators. So one of the things that I always argue that we're really bad at across the board is multi-agency working to prevent sexual abuse. And, you know, yesterday we were talking about multi-agency working in Latvia, and you know what? We're brilliant at it at the back end. When people come out, we've got MAPA, probation, talk to the police, who talk to social care, but actually at the front end, schools only talk if there's a major exclusion. Social work don't necessarily connect with the relevant organizations. Police will reach out to people if there's something going on. So the reality is we need to be able to identify at-risk individuals. But you know what? We know who they are. If you go and talk to any social worker, they'll say, you know, some of these kids or these families are problematic, and we think something's going to happen here or something is happening here. We know the risk factors, we know the protective factors, but we don't do enough of that joining up at the front end. And it's about prevention. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about different levels of interventions. So all of these interventions occur at the community, the society, and the individual level. And if you look at the CDC, that's the way they talk about public health approaches. But generally speaking, there's 4 types of prevention. There's primary, so broad stroke approaches that take place before sexual abuse has occurred. Generally speaking, in our field, what that means is community engagement. So that means the NSPCC or some Bardos or children's charities or the governments doing messaging campaigns about what is sexual abuse. What does sexual abuse look like? How do you report sexual abuse? Different organizations may be going into schools and doing work with children. Maybe your HR department talking to you about what's appropriate behavior at work and what's not appropriate behavior at work. So it's those broad-based approaches, and we do quite a lot of that. I'm sure all of you can think about campaigns in your countries based around sexual abuse, informing people about what it is and how to report it and how to engage with it. We're seeing a lot of this at universities at the minute. So Universities UK has identified 3 of the biggest factors affecting students at university are interpersonal violence, sexual abuse, and hate crime. So all universities in the UK are doing something about this, but you're also seeing it in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand. The institutional child sexual abuse scandals and sexual abuse scandals have prompted a lot of institutions to think about the messages that they send and the way that they do preventative work. So secondary is targeted at-risk populations. This is where we're not so good. And the beacon in this is from Germany, and it's Project Dunkelfeld. And it's the notion that you can come forward and seek confidential help if you think you're at risk of committing a sexual offense. Now, there's a couple of things that have to be said about this, which I sometimes think makes it quite unique to Germany. First of all, Germany has very different disclosure regulations. So if someone says something to a therapist or a client or a professional, in Germany, there's not mandatory reporting. And mandatory reporting is a bit of a minefield anyway. But Germany, there is no compulsion for you to report this to anybody else. So when you start to think about other countries, you start to say, well, actually, could we have that in our country? And the political uphill struggle that you would have to get that would be a real challenge. The second thing that Duncanfeld does is it frames sexual abuse as a mental health problem. So yes, you may be pedophilic or you may be a child sexual abuser, but you've also got depression. So we're going to deal with your depression first. So they sort of root people into a mental health pathway that is very different to what you see in a lot of other westernized countries. But there is a growing notion that actually we should do this. So we're starting to see some of this in the UK with the Safer Living Foundation doing some work in Nottingham around this, and they're trying to set up a walk-in clinic in conjunction with Nottingham Trent University. We're seeing STOPSO, which is Stop Sexual Offending, which is a collection of therapists and counselors who want to work with individuals who self-identify as being at risk of committing sexual abuse. But we have a long way to go on this. And just thinking about the context of online offenders and people who view images, the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, which is this one here, has something called Engage. So say you're looking at child sexual exploitation material online. A pop-up will come from them, basically saying you shouldn't be looking at this material, and it will direct you to their website, and it will enable you to go through an anonymous module where you learn about the reality and the impact of child sexual exploitation material. And then it will offer you the opportunity to seek further help, and it will advise and guide you in that area. I was at a conference with someone from the Lucy Faithfull a couple of years ago, just after this had launched. It was 9 months after it launched. And they said they had over 1 million hits in 9 months. And that goes back to what Simon Bailey was saying. We can't police our way out of this. We have to find alternatives. And we have to really think about and engage with the challenge. Now, the third one is something that we do all the time. In health, it's called relapse prevention. For us, it's called sex offender treatment. And everyone who comes through the system gets it to varying degrees, depending what country they're in, depending what their level of risk is, and depending upon their engagement with the system. But its principle is to stop them from relapsing, from reoffending. So I have a bit of a struggle sometimes with this in language. We talk about treatment, and I'm not sure treatment's the right word. I don't know whether we want to call it an intervention or management, because it is really about giving people the skills to manage their behavior. Treatment gives ideas about cure and about doing away with things. And you don't cure sexual abuse. You enable people to stop offending and to understand the impact of their offending on other people. So for many years, I say many years, about 5 years, we talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary, and that was it. And I was doing a piece of work with some colleagues, and we came across this one, quaternary, which doesn't really get talked about a lot in sexual abuse. And, you know, feeding on from what Audrey was saying and feeding on from what Mathilde was saying, this is where things like circles sits. So quaternary is action taken to protect the individual from medical interventions that are more likely to cause harm than good. So you might think about things like the register. You might think about not being able to get a job or engaging with communities that increases social isolation. so that these individuals think of themselves constantly at risk. And organizations like Circles provide a buffer around this that mitigates some of these factors. They aid that transition. They show the individual that although there is things that they need to be held accountable for, and the state dictates what those things are, that there actually is support structures there to help them. The other thing that I would say about quaternary is that it enables some of the more stigmatizing things to be reduced. And we know from sex offender treatment programs that things that work are social connectedness, strengths-based approaches, and an understanding that your sexual abuse is not all of who you are. It is a part of who you are. And so this work mitigates some of the other problems. But as we can see, we generally live in primary and tertiary, and we need to do more work at secondary because we can prevent these things. We know the risk factors and the protective factors. We can do some work around this. So, hopefully these slides will be available on the CEP website, but if anybody wants them, in advance of that, feel free to drop me an email. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop me one. So this is from a piece of work that was conducted through the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. And we looked at international approaches to sex offender risk management, assessment, and prevention. And this is from about 16 countries. And what you say, and one of these 3 questions were about prevention and where they think their countries are at in terms of prevention. So for instance, the vast majority of people, so about half of them, disagree that their government's attitude to sexual abuse is about prevention. They think it's about criminal justice processes. They think it's about punishment. They don't think it's about prevention. Do your colleagues understand the prevention of sexual abuse? The vast majority of them think that they do. And that's important because that means we have to stop talking to this group and start talking to this group. One of the problems that we often have is in the grand scheme of criminology and psychology, sexual abuse is a small group of people. When you compare it to violent offenders or when you compare it to acquisition crime or stuff like that. So we need to start having conversations with governments, with departments of health and social care, with education about prevention. And then the last one here was, do the public understand it? And people were divided between not sure and don't know. And there is still a view out there that sexual abuse is committed by distinct others, by people who are radically different from us. And that helps us a great deal. Because if you're saying that a sex offender is someone who is mentally disordered, who is a monster, who is problematic, that means they're at fault and it's not society's problem and it's not our problem. It's that pathologizing of the individual, and that makes us say, well, we don't have to change. They have to change, but we don't have to change. So I think, so some of the basic stuff that has come out of this is that actually we need to do more public work and we need to do more governmental work around this. So I'm going to talk through 10 points about the reframing of this. So I saw this cartoon and I loved it because on one level you look at them both and they're like, yes, we're on the same page. It's great. We're happy to see each other. But actually, this man here is going, great, there's a boat. I can get off this godforsaken island. Where this man here is like, great, there's an island. I can get off this godforsaken boat. And we always assume that we're talking about the same thing in the same way and using the same language, and we're not. So we've just done a study of police officers' attitude to risk and risk assessment. We're looking at probation and prison service at the minute. And anecdotally, when you talk to different people, and you talk about risk assessment and you talk about risk and risk management, it turns out it's not the same. The police think very differently about what risk is compared to probation, compared to schools and education. So actually, we have to find a common language that we're all talking. But this also begs the question of what are we talking about? We use the word sex offender quite a lot. I've used it numerous times in this presentation. So I went to say, and I have seen on numerous occasions, people like Gwenda Willis and people like Elizabeth Letourneau, and their argument is, why would you call someone by the thing you don't want them to be? And actually, that sort of makes you step back and think for a minute. And so I just want everyone to stop. This isn't audience participation. Don't put your hand up. But I want you to think about the worst thing you have ever done to another person. So would you like everyone to know what that is? And would you like to be called by that every time you see someone else? Probably not. Would it make you feel very good about yourself? Wouldn't compel you to change? Wouldn't compel you to not do it again? And in criminology, we call this labeling theory. And we know that when you label offenders as offenders, it can get deep-seated within themselves. And it sort of goes against treatment, doesn't it? Because if treatment's about strengths-based approaches, and if treatment's about change, being constantly referred to as the thing that you've done and not being able to move past that is difficult. So there is a movement about using first-person language, and we have seen this in other elements of our work. We don't really talk about mentally ill people anymore. We talk about people with a mental illness. We talk about people with a learning difficulty. In Scotland, they don't talk about offenders. They talk about people who have been to prison. And so there's an argument that instead of saying the word sex offender, we should be saying person who has committed a sexual offense. And there's this notion that in doing that, we can hold people accountable, but we can also say this isn't all that you are, because we know that sexual offending is complex. And we know that you may have an individual who has committed horrific sexual offenses, but may also be a brilliant computer designer, or an athlete, or a really supportive son to their mother when they're going through cancer. It